So yeah, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining our forum on fire ecologies, what challenges for sustainability science. You might be familiar. Sorry, another mishap. My mic got blocked. I was just saying that you might be already familiar or have already attended one of our Pathways forums. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Pathways Forum is an open webinar series to discuss and create a space for reflection and mutual learning on a variety of sustainability science topics, concepts, methods, and cases. But from now on, the forums will be inscribed in a new, broader project that we're currently developing at the Pathways Initiative, which is the Pathways Deep Dive. And to just say a few words about the Pathways Deep Dive, this project has the objective of raising awareness in the sustainability science community about the connections between the ecological crisis and the socio and geopolitical tensions we're currently observing around the world. And our aim is to foster understanding of how authoritarian and far-right movements are strategizing to obstruct climate action and also discredit sustainability science. But at the same time, we also want to explore the many forms of resistance and responses that have taken shape against far-right and authoritarian dynamics, both within and outside science. And we do so through various activities, such as a conference that we organized in France last June. The translation in English would be Knowledge in Turbulent Times. In French, it was Les Savoirs dans la Tourmente. And we also organize webinars such as this one, blogs, and also activities for scientific mediation. And we're currently disseminating a questionnaire about how the current socio and geopolitical tensions are affecting scientists. And we will forward you the information after this webinar, and we'll be very grateful if you can help us by filling it in and also circulating to your networks. We would be sure of sharing the results with you. But since the topic of the deep dive, as you can see, is broad and complex, today we will be focusing specifically around the narratives and strategies that far-right movements use when it comes to climate and environmental issues. And with their increasing influence worldwide, it is important to critically examine the discourses and the practices employed by these movements that they use to co-opt, distort, and weaponize ecological issues. And it is also interesting to see how they differ depending on historical, economic, and socio-political contexts. Sorry. And so to unpack the dense topic of today's forum, we're very glad to be joined by our speakers, Bernard Faulkner from the University of Leicester, Balsal Barda from the University of Pompeu Fabra, and Shenor Huram from York University in Canada. And so Bernard will first talk about the complexity of environmental communication and the specific narratives and discourses employed by the far right in Europe. Balsa will then proceed to talk about the relationship between the far right and environmental politics, specifically in the context of Eastern Europe. And lastly, Snor will present us a case study of the relationship between violent insurgent groups and climate change, specifically in the context of Boko Haram in Nigeria. So just to explain you a little bit about the structure of this webinar, the first part will be dedicated to the presentations of our speakers. And after each presentation, we'll have time for one or two clarifying questions. But please save your more complex, substantial questions for the second part of the webinar, which will be a discussion space for you to ask your questions and express your thoughts and remarks. And the second part of the webinar will be a discussion, an open discussion with you, and it will be facilitated by Noemi Gonda, who is a researcher and associate professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, who is also one of the scientific advisors to our Pathways Deep Dive, and who helped us greatly in developing this project, providing us with ideas and lots of helpful feedback. I would now suggest getting right into the presentations. And I guess we can go with the order of the speakers on the screen. So, Bernard, if you want, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I hope everybody can see my slides. Excellent. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other presentations and of course the discussions. And thanks also for the organizers to suggest the title, because I was initially wondering kind of how to structure this, but then with the notion of complexities in the title, that really helped me to structure this brief presentation, which is really introductory, but which is built around complexities or ambiguities within these far-right stances, these far-right narratives about the environment. And yeah, just to reiterate that, I'm focusing on Europe. If we would take on board, for example, India, the Indian situation, things would get even more complex, but that is maybe something for the discussion or for another time. Okay, so these are the 4/5 sections, basically for very broad complexities, we might say. I'm going to start with the most fundamental one, the, if you like, tension or often observed tension between stances on climate change on the one hand, and on the other hand, the local or national environment. Then I'm going to look at complexities when it comes to climate change, climate obstruction even. Then I'm going to very briefly look at renewables, and then kind of back to the beginning, looking at stances when it comes to local and national nature and kind of the differences which exist there. And then a very, very brief concluding slide. So yeah, let's begin with what is probably best known, and most of us will have probably seen this or noticed this. The complexity one, what I've referred to recently as double vision. So on the one hand, there is widespread skepticism, let's call it skepticism for now, or obstructionist stance when it comes to climate change. Again, there are complexities there, but this stance ranges from outright denial of the scientific evidence to opposition to climate change policies, mitigation policies, and so on and so forth. So you have a cover here from the British National Party, which is / was, it's not really relevant any longer, an extreme right party in the UK. And you do have also another image in the middle, the one at the top, the man who yeah, is kind of pointing out that he is under economic pressure because of green policies which are destroying the infrastructure, the industry. So there's a range of stances when it comes to the environment, but when it comes to climate change, but largely obstructionist. And that is juxtaposed by a widespread affirmation of the natural, the local, the national environment. Think about the romanticization of nature. Think about an image of the nation as being rooted in the land, as emerging from the land, as being formed by the land, as being responsible for the land. But the land here is a bounded territory. So that goes back to classic nationalist ideas of what the nation, ethno-nationalist ideas, I should say, of what the nation is about. And the difference here is one between the concrete and particular on the one hand, and on the other hand, the abstract and global. Now, this kind of insight into this difference, this fundamental difference, is kind of very well established. Not kind of, it is very well established, and it goes back to the beginning, I would say, of the more contemporary wave of work on the far right and the environment. And Balscher, for example, in his research, has pointed to the same the developments or positions. So we have this fundamental complexity within positions, stances, narratives. But we also have within the climate debate, if you like, we have complexities, we have differences. And that's where I want to begin with by saying a few words about this notion of obstruction. So a few years ago, people spoke about, for example, climate skepticism, spoke about climate denial, and more recently, what has emerged as the umbrella term is that of obstruction, climate obstruction. So whenever policies are blocked or when the scientific evidence is denied, we speak of obstruction these days. There is then a further differentiation of that concept. And the proposal here is that we speak of maybe primary obstruction when it's about the denial of scientific evidence. We speak of secondary obstruction when it is about policies, narratives, which do not necessarily deny that anthropogenic climate change happens, but push back against mitigation policies. For example, by saying that this would destroy the economy, this would lead to deindustrialization in Europe, and so on and so forth. And then there's a tertiary obstruction, which I'm not going to go into because it's not that relevant today. But this is the complexity when it comes to climate obstruction more generally. And when we then look at the far right, we find this obstruction. This is from an article I published with Balscher just a few years ago, but as you can see, I've added a few more references. What I'm going to say now is really kind of well established in the literature. What we did in this paper on the European Union, or the European Parliament specifically, was we looked at speeches, at claims made in speeches in the Parliament, in the European Parliament 6, 7, and 8. So between 2004 and 2019, I'm not going into all the details, we don't need to look at all these numbers, but what was interesting to see is that the basic stance of these explanations, of these speeches, in 55% there was an acceptance of anthropogenic climate change, a basic acceptance. So we can't simply say that there is primary obstruction, all over the place when it comes to the far right. Clearly, at least they say, at least in their stories, their claims, their arguments, they don't necessarily deny outright. In 12%, we had primary obstruction. We had denial of scientific evidence. Okay, 33% it wasn't quite clear. But when it comes to the far right, what I'm saying here is that positions are diverse, but overall, they very much were obstructionists. It's just that they were not primarily primary obstructionist or outright denialist. The situation was that they were primarily secondary obstructionist. So we didn't find a lot of what is here referred to as evidence skepticism. So that's the kind of the old terminology. This is what today would be referred to as primary obstruction. We had 150 cases or codes of primary obstruction. But when you compare this to what we also coded, other types, other claims of obstruction, response skepticism, for example, the claim, the argument, the story about the economy and jobs should not be harmed. You can see that we had a massive 314 there. So that argument, that story alone, which falls under the category of of secondary obstruction and was used to oppose mitigation policies is twice as significant as the entire evidence or primary obstructionist category. And then there are, of course, many other claims, stories, however you want to refer to them, which fall into this secondary obstructionist camp or category. Just to further support this and to give you some evidence that it's not just Balja and I who have come up with this. This is from a nice article by Cupers, who basically analyzed the Alternative for Germany's output. So the Alternative for Germany is a particularly climate skeptic far-right party. And what she found, again, she has these percentages here. As you can see, evidence skepticism, what we now refer to as primary obstruction, 16%. So quite similar to what we found in our study, where we had these 12%. But then, she has all these instances of process and response skepticism. So things we would today describe as a secondary obstruction. And to make things, quote unquote, worse or more complex, we do not only have these different types of obstruction within the far right and their climate discourse, we even have cases, for they are not dominant, where there is proper, quote unquote, acceptance of anthropogenic climate change. So let's start maybe with this quote on the right-hand side by Gordon Dawn, which is or was basically a neo-Nazi Greek party. And as you can see here, so they are not entirely happy with the Paris Agreement, but their point is that it's not pushing hard enough when it comes to global warming and climate policies. So that's a really interesting position. I also I've given you a few more numbers at the bottom, right below that quote. And for example, there is one claim we coded 60 times: global climate change requires global responses. So some within the far right even make these arguments. Again, this is clearly not dominating. I mean, compare these 60 to the 314, for example, about economy and jobs, which should not be harmed. But there is a group within the far right which makes these claims. And just to give you one more example, this image on the left-hand side from German Voice, which is the party newspaper, or was the party newspaper of the German National Democratic Party in the late 80s. They had articles, and by the way, others within that spectrum in the late 80s and 90s had articles which acknowledged anthropogenic climate change. Basically, what this infographic says is the greenhouse gas effect, humanity in the heating trap, and then it explains the greenhouse effect. And even if you don't understand German, can't read that infographic, you immediately recognize that this is basically what is circulated in mainstream media until today, when media try to explain the greenhouse effect. And this position was, this acceptance was fairly common, at least until the mid-late 90s. Now, moving to renewables, and I will be much quicker now. What is not complex or not so complex is far-right positions when it comes to wind energy. It's pretty hegemonic, not entirely, but there's a widespread skepticism when it comes to wind energy. When it comes to solar, for example, much more split. So this is something which is developing now, and it might well be that in a few years' time we have a much more widespread skepticism or opposition. I've one image here in the middle at the bottom, taken from the UK, where there has recently been some push also by Reform, the far right, the new far right party there, to support opposition to solar farms. But then also there's a long history in some parts, at least, of Europe and the far right, very much in favor of having at least solar energy. So the image in the middle, the upper one, is basically about hope for the future. The biggest solar plant is opened in the Alps, and the Freedom Party of Austria celebrates that. And on the right-hand side, you have a booklet where, again, they celebrate to some extent renewable energy sources. And the argument behind that is that renewable energies enable the nation to be autark, to be self-sufficient. And that is, of course, something which resonates very well with far-right nationalist actors. The final point, final complexity, we have already heard, I've already said at the very beginning, that there is this widespread romanticization of the land, this idea that the people emerge from the land, romanticization of the countryside as being the place where the nation is truly at home, where the nation is truly rooted, and that is juxtaposed with the city, the city where all the bad things happen. Again, this is pretty well established. There is also work on the far right as favoring environmental or organic farming, opposing glyphosate, for example, and so on and so forth. There are tendencies such as the folkish settlers, where far right people actually move to the land to have their commune, to live in close proximity to the soil and work with the soil. We even find this and we might hear more about this later. We find such ideas of blood and soil, of course, also in eco-fascist propaganda. There's even some degrowth policy in some parts of the far right, very, very kind of similar to left-wing degrowth politics, but of course there are also difference, but something to take serious. And this is something we see, for example, in France. We also see that in Germany. But we also see the opposite. And this is something we have seen more recently with the protests, the farmer protests, and the positions far-right parties have taken, usually in support of these farmer protests. And these farmer protests were, of course, protests against, largely against green policies, green pushes by Europe. Okay, so here too, a complexity. Final slide. It's all about for me at least, and to obviously cut a long and complex story short, it's about the intersection of various elements which might explain or explains why different actors take different positions and thus create this complexity. Might have to do with ideology, might have to do with strategy, political opportunity structures, the political field, and where this or that political party, thinks it can actually make some gains. It also has to do with networks and the flow of ideas, to what extent, for example, ideas from the climate change counter movement in the US initially, in the 90s or the early 2000s, how these ideas, or what point these ideas and with what force these ideas might have flown from the States to European countries. So what we need is, in my view, context-sensitive reconstructions of cases in order to understand the interplay of these elements. And with that, I am done and coming to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for your presentation. It was indeed very, very interesting. Thank you for that. So now we have time for a few clarifying questions, maybe one or two max. I see a question in the chat from Nina Canerva. I think to me this sounds a bit more substantial, and I guess we can save that if you're okay with that, Nina, for the discussions later. Because I'm sure perhaps with the inputs of the other speakers, we will also have more material. Um, Although I think we could take the one from Heather Albero. Do you want Heather to reformulate the question or? Um,
Oh, hi. Yes, Viola. No, yeah, I was just interested in when you were talking about, thank you so much for that, by the way. When you were talking about resistance to solar and wind, and I was just curious what you've seen in terms of the key factors for some far right individuals being very resistant to wind and solar. Just seemed like kind of random. I mean, I was thinking about other factors like gender, so Daggett's notion of petromasculinities, and maybe some of them might benefit, but I was just curious what you think the re some of the key reasons are for this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Daggett is excellent, and it would have also been one of my reference in response to this question. So, on a more ideological level, it is, for example, the idea that a certain type of masculinity, whether we call it petromasculinity or fossil masculinity or whatever, is perceived to be under threat by these renewable energy sources. And the way these energy sources have been presented is maybe really not helpful because very often they are presented also visually, by the way, as clean and so on and so forth, and that is then at least implicitly juxtaposed with quote unquote dirty jobs. And somebody who might be in such a job or who might have affinities in such a job, it's not going to perceive that well. But there's this gender dimension. There's also, for example, the aspect which has a lot to do with nationalist ideology, the aesthetics of the land, and maybe the perception that wind turbines threaten the land and the beauties of the land, this sort of stuff. Obviously, you mentioned that there are, at times at least, and that's certainly something which we have for a long time seen in the US, maybe leaders who have certain interests, um, financial ones, and they therefore push back. But that is more in terms of, a competitor. So we have specific interests, and that's why we push back. Slightly different, maybe from these more, what we might call ideological ideas to do with gender and the aesthetics. Mm, yeah, I will stop here. Maybe others have more to say, or we come back to it later.
Thank you very much.
Great. Um, I would say that now we can go on to the next presentation. So, Balsha, I would invite you to take the floor.
Okay, I see I was muted. I hope you can see
Yeah,
the
perfect.
slides. Wonderful. Thank you once again. Thank you for having me. And as I said before the meeting, thanks to all of those who are listening to us on either a Friday afternoon in most of Europe or Friday morning or evening. In any way, much appreciated. Um, Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today, much as I was kind of expected to speak more about the particular region or a couple of regions that are, subsumed under this signifier of Eastern Europe, which is contested as well heavily. I will kind of reiterate on a few points that Ben had already made. It is a bit of a unfortunate circumstance that both Benhard and I are a part of the panel in the sense that most of the things that I'm going to say really pretty much go along what he's about to say. So I'm not sure there's going to be a whole lot of contestation there, a whole lot of dispute. But it may also allow the audience to kind of understand where the research in this field has been um, how it has been developing. And then I will also try to use the opportunity to cast light on something that is not necessarily related to the far right, but it is a part of the far right communication that is the broader right in Eastern Europe and outside of Eastern Europe as well. Anyways, there's a lot about terminology here, and I've pretty much wrote the whole book kind of suggesting that there should be a terminological shift. I'm not going to unpack this argument into greater detail, but you all know that there are many ways in which this far-right affinity towards the natural environment has been conceptualized. I just listed 4 options here. There are many more. And the core argument of this book, Far-Right Ecologism, it used these examples, Eastern European examples, that is Central East Europe examples, to explain that what the far right has been doing on the environment cannot really be reduced to this almost historical eco-fascism, where it's like a kind of either extremist or ecocentric affinity towards the land. The far right has been a lot more savvy in terms of developing its environmental strategies, and I think the Eastern European example, much as it's not that obvious, shows this as well. So my basic argument, or the argument of the book, was that far right ecologism kind of urges us to think beyond just fascism, to think about how the far right actually communicates environmental issues and climate change, and why it sometimes is so difficult to kind of distinguish what the far right has to say on climate from what other political options communicate or argue or vote on. Bernhard pretty much outlined this, so I will rush through this part. The 2 far-right climates, the 2 far-right ways of discussing climate issue. There are of course many more, but there is this very obvious tension in the far right ideology as such, that is often carried in these contextual settings and contextual specificities, between this global abstract threat that is usually not something the far right necessarily cares about, so climate change being a very obvious one, and the local affinity for the natural environment, which is derived from the core tenets of nationalist ideology, as Bernhard said. So they're like, how to kind of position themselves between these 2 poles. This is something that the far right has always been trying to make sense of, and sometimes with more, sometimes with less success in doing so. For quite some time, obviously, Bernhard showed this as well, that far right has been either denialist or kind of idle, didn't have anything to say on the environment, hardly ever proactive in the sense of endorsing progressive climate policies. But I think ever since the 2010s, probably even earlier, there's been a visible shift, as Bernhard has shown, towards this so-called secondary or tertiary obstruction, but also this yes but, as I argue in the piece with Manuela Caiani, a form of environmentalism where obviously the far right formally engages accepts and acknowledges the existence of climate change, but at the same time is not willing to take any major steps towards it. There are many ideological reasons for why this is the case, and I listed some of these. What is important for the far right when it comes to climate change is to kind of offer its own brand of environmentalism that is obviously different from the left or from that of the Green Party. So we had rational environmentalisms, methodical environmentalisms, commonsensical environmentalisms. These were all the coinages that were used by the far right themselves, by the far right parties, most of which were actually in Eastern Europe, especially Fidesz in Hungary and Law and Justice Party in Poland. I did mention also petromasculinities. Climate change and environment are very useful for frame bridging. So gender and immigration are only one of the examples in which sometimes the far right brings the environment to the terrains in which it feels more comfortable in. So the immigration discourse and gender policy. I mean, policy. It's really the politics related to the issue of gender. Now, far right in climate change today, what we know is that there has been this shift, as Bernhard has suggested. I kind of argue that even though I cannot really substantiate it with evidence, and this is a part of my ongoing research, that this shift has slowed down, shift towards climate acceptance from the far right. And I think that this could be mainly attributed to the war in Ukraine and the associated costs of the war, also related to energy, but also, on the other hand, the pandemic, which has kind of prompted these anti-intellectual types of arguments. There are important regional differences. Again, apologies for the presentation so far has been heavily Eurocentric, and it will be for the remainder of my address. I hope the next presentation will kind of allow us to understand what is happening in the rest of the world. But even Europe is not a monolith if we're talking about far right and climate change. In my research with Louis Dean, we kind of found that Northern Europe is this kind of where the general population, but is mostly kind of accepting the existence of climate change. And Eastern Europe, this is actually a mistake. Eastern Europe is the home of climate acceptance when it comes to the far right, whereas Western Europe is this more kind of used to, where the far right parties are more used to straightforwardly deny the existence of climate change and openly obstruct climate policies. What is interesting about Eastern Europe is that, again, most models trying to explain the lack of support for climate policies indicate no clear ideological separation. Or actually, they do indicate a clear ideological separation, but they do not do that in Europe, so they don't work in Europe. Again, this ideological separation is that those individuals who will position themselves on the 0 to 10 self-positioning left-right scale. So those who consider themselves to be left-wing are more likely to be pro-environmentalist, acknowledge the existence of climate change, and overall support more progressive environmental policies, whereas obviously those on the right are less likely to do so. This distinction, as I said, is very visible in most of the European regions, but Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is where this kind of picture becomes a bit blurry. So I indicated that, again, there's this conceptual game changer. This is the update for 2022, the research that I did with Louis Dean, and I think it hasn't really changed significantly. So yes, the far right is still slightly more likely to far right organizations that we examined, slightly more likely to straightforwardly deny the existence of climate change, but we also saw a shift in favor of the climate acceptance. Now, to finally get to the point of why Eastern Europe is so different, the recent paper, which was very interesting, the recent article by Gjimal Abuse and others in Party Politics, offers some explanations, but it in a pretty much lists them, not really tests them like as hypothesis. There is obviously this different pathway, different evolution of democracies. Speaking of the post-socialist experience, what is interesting about Central Eastern Europe more specifically is that it consistently shows more support for populist parties than elsewhere. The left-right divide bears a different meaning in this region as compared to the West. And then, of course, we have the fossil fuel dependence in the energy mix, the so-called post-materialist values. There's been plenty of research in this direction, some of which I do not necessarily buy into, but it could be argued that Eastern European countries have a slightly lower salience of the environmental issue and climate issue more specifically, and that is why this issue has never kind of gained so much traction in domestic politics. Climate change and far-right manifestos is usually a space where climate policy is going to be challenged, but so this is I'm speaking about Europe in general, but in Eastern Europe, it can take one of these two forms. I kind of suggest, again, for conceptually speaking about this, it is either about technocracy, so these kind of eco-modernizing solutions, more investments, green economy, green energy, green this, green that, or reclaiming the environment from the left. So kind of trying to offer its own brand of ecologism as such. An example is shown on the picture on the right, which is also a picture from my book, communication by the Hungarian far-right party Jobbik, which used to be one of the most prominent extreme right parties in the region. Green nationalism, protect environment, protect your home. And the tree holding, the hand holding a tree in the shape of pre-Trianon Hungary, so the borders of the Greater Hungary, again referring to historical revisionism. There's again this but, green extractivism and green sacrifice. So as a part of this EU focus on critical minerals that are obviously indispensable to the energy transition, there has been expansion on the European semi-periphery, looking for lithium mining projects, Rio Tinto's investment in Serbia, also small hydro in the Balkans. This has been an opportunity for a development of environmentalism, both on the left and the right. And the right has been quite successful in, again, using these local environmental concerns to kind of attach them to these anti-elitist sentiments. So the elites from Brussels imposing this green transition on the people of Serbia, etc., etc. What is interesting is that in most of these cases, especially in the case of Serbia, you cannot really say that the party in power is a far-right party, or I mean, you also could, but the party of Aleksandar Vučić, the Serb Progressive Party, has strong ties with far-right militias, with far-right organizations, some of which are quite informal, and quite often they are used against environmental activists as well. So this connection, this intersection is very interesting. Then there's also this element of communicating these issues over social media, the so-called de-ideologizing of nature. If you look at the many pages of far-right parties in Europe, in Eastern Europe, if you look at their environmental sections, some of the far-right parties actually do have environmental sections of their parties and environmental Facebook pages, social media pages, you're likely to see that there's not a whole lot that is blatantly far right about this communication. An example is the image on the right, basically a Hungarian extreme right party celebrating World Bee Day, and a quote allegedly by Albert Einstein, if bees become extinct, humanity will become extinct. So nothing far right nationalist, ideological, no flags. I mean, yes, there's a flag of Mihazank, which is in the obviously in their logo, but there's nothing necessarily nationalist about this communication. And this is becoming a problem from the perspective of recognizing far-right messages and far-right argumentation on climate change. So this is, I think, a very important takeaway. I want to finish with this ongoing research of mine and my colleagues. There's a paper that will hopefully come out next year with Aron Buzogan, which looked into the right-wing, like more broader right-wing communication on the environment in the East, but also in the West of Europe. We looked into the European Parliament. What was interesting is that we saw that there's no such thing as mainstreaming of the far right in the environmental domain, or if we see that the far right argumentation on climate and the environmental issues is becoming taken up by the center-right parties, it is happening only at a very limited level. So, for instance, in the European Parliament, you have these European Parliament groups. What we saw is that the ECR, which always used to be this like kind of middle-right party between the center and the far-right European Parliament groups, many members, politicians, members of European Parliament are now more likely to vote similar to the far right now. But this is not happening with the Christian Democrats, with the center right. So what we see on the right is like this Hicks's index, meaning that if you see these bars, these were different European Parliament terms. Again, I do not have much time to explain the method here, but this is basically consistency in voting among the European members of the European Parliament. So the Greens kind of exhibit the highest consistency, the Social Democrats as well. We're speaking specifically on environmental issues. What you see is that the united right, if we looked into the right as a general conglomerate, it kind of actually reduces the Higg's index is decreasing over time, meaning that there's less mainstreaming, there's less cohesion when it comes to the voting. At the same time, ecological modernization never has and likely never will get the right too far. So this attempt of the right to kind of play with this environmental communication in these technocratic terms, as it has done, especially when in power in Eastern Europe, it's not likely to win them a lot of votes, and they're very much aware of it. But at the same time, they're also very much aware that this kind of discourse is useful for projects, is useful for obviously money making as well, financing the parties, the regimes, and yes, as a consequence of that, we see the Eastern European right being not as confrontational on the environmental issues and of course climate as it is in the West. So to conclude again, this climate change acceptance has kind of, I think, decreased in terms of its scope. I may be wrong. You will see future studies kind of retesting what Bernhard and I found in our couple of papers. But nonetheless, our counter communication strategies have to be adjusted. As the salience of climate is on the rise, it's obviously likely that the trends of these blurry communication from the far right will continue. And it does make me wonder, and this is what I want to end with, what exactly makes the far right different from others if we're thinking in terms of this yes, but conditional environmentalism? Because all of the parties on the ideological spectrum, unfortunately, or most of the parties, are not willing to take strong steps in the direction of not just decarbonization, but really making a more like a transition that is definitely going to be more just and more welcoming, especially to those who are underprivileged groups in a society. Finally, the worrying authoritarian tendencies, it's not just the far right that we should necessarily focus on. There's a lot of these hybrid regimes where I, again, use Serbia as an example, where you cannot clearly say that the far right party is in power, or you can, but the political scientists wouldn't agree. But then again, most of the tactics are really resembling authoritarian regimes, and as such are highly, highly problematic. Thanks very much for the time. I was a few minutes over the limit, I believe, but nonetheless, look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valsa, for your presentation. So we have time for clarifying questions, if anyone has any. You can also write them in the chat, but it seems that Valsa's presentation was very clear, and it was indeed. All right, I think we can go into the last but not least presentation of the day. Shinor, I will give you the floor. I don't think they can hear you. I think you're muted.
Oh, there we
Yes.
go. Hope everyone can hear me now. Well, thank you, Balsha and Bernhard, for two great presentations. And thank you to the Pathways for having me present today. I'm really excited, and this is a great conversation. So I guess I want to get started first by naming what feels like the elephant in the room, which is the fact that my case study focuses on Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin in northeastern Nigeria. And it's a movement that rarely, if ever, gets placed within discussions on the far right. And it's almost always treated as a terrorist group. And it's precisely that epistemological weight of that label that I want to interrogate in my presentation today. So the fact that Boko Haram might not be traditionally assumed to belong to a panel on far-right ecologies is not really a coincidence, and it reflects a deeply Eurocentric, Islamophobic, and Orientalist assumptions in our conceptual vocabularies. When political violence emerges from white actors in the global north, we describe that as far-right populism or extremist nationalism or anti-democratic mobilization. And we take care to analyze its structural drivers, its ideological contours, its socioeconomic grievances, etc. Essentially, we treat its adherents as rational political subjects situated within material conditions that are worth understanding. But when political violence, oops, sorry, not yet. But when political violence emerges from Muslim actors in the global south, we call it terrorism. And positioning the Muslim militant as irrational and pathologizing him as mad allows global security architectures overwhelmingly anchored in Euro-American power to depoliticize their own coercive interventions and recast imperial counterinsurgency policies as humanitarian necessities that often lead to mass incarceration, torture, drone warfare, and total elimination. So my aim here is not to deny that Boko Haram engages in acts of terror. My point here is to make the distinction between the far right and terrorism has never been analytically neutral. It's racialized and it reveals who is understood to be a political actor and who is cast as an existential threat. White supremacist movements that use terror are frequently still placed in the category of the far right. Muslim movements that use similar tactics are automatically categorized as terrorists, and that asymmetry is not intellectually defensible, in my opinion. You might be thinking that Boko Haram's violence is too extreme to be compared to far-right groups, but when we rely on aesthetic judgments about violence, we reproduce Orientalist hierarchies that treat white violence as rational and global South violence as monstrous. My comparison and contrast is about examining the shared political, economic, ecological drivers, governance practices, and reactionary imaginaries that drive this form of violence. This epistemological split forecloses the possibility of placing global South movements within far-right analyses, even when they share the core structural features like exclusionary identity politics, patriarchal authority, anti-democratic worldviews, nostalgia for an idealized traditional past, and the belief that the state has been captured by corrupt or impure forces. Far-right scholarship overwhelmingly analyzes the global north because it assumes that the global north is the norm and that far-right populism is an aberration. Meanwhile, in the global south, it's always coded as unstable, uncivilized, and primitive. There's no abnormality to explain because reactionary violence is assumed to be part of its natural condition. And this divide produces real policy consequences. Calling Boko Haram terrorism, but white nationalist violence far right, normalizes one as political and exceptionalizes the other as pathological. And as a consequence, it invites militarized, technocratic, and externalized solutions for the global south while offering socioeconomic explanations for the global north. However, there is a growing body of literature that troubles this divide and shows how militant Islamism and the far right are not opposites, but actually parallel phenomena that are shaped by the same global structures. So research from the Global Network on Extremism and Terrorism has, among others, have identified shared drivers, like I mentioned before, disillusionment with neoliberal capitalism, nostalgia for a pure past, monolithic identities, anti-state sentiment, patriarchal domination, mistrust of mainstream media, and a politics of resentment that's grounded in exclusion. A common critique is that the far right seeks to capture state institutions, whereas Boko Haram functions as an insurgency outside of it. But this critique presumes the existence of a consolidated Weberian state in Nigeria, something that the Lake Chad Basin doesn't offer because the state doesn't have reach in that region. In contexts where the state is fragmented, withdrawn, or only nominally present, territorial control and insurgent governance become the primary modes of political contestation. In these kinds of settings, Boko Haram's actions are not analogous to electoral politics, but they are analogous to the far right's project of remaking political order. The form differs, but the political function is pretty similar. So it's in this spirit of analytical expansion that I place Boko Haram within this conversation because it's embedded in the same structural conditions that animate far-right violence globally. Boko Haram emerges from and responds to the political ecology of the Capitalocene, decades of colonial extraction, neoliberal restructuring, ecological collapse, and state fragility. If far-right movements are mobilizing ecological anxieties in the global north, Boko Haram's silence, which I will get to in a second, its silence on climate change, its governance of land, water, mobility, and its operation collapsing ecological landscape are equally as relevant. And this unique case study lets us see how reactionary movements in the global south respond to environmental crises and why we can't understand these crises without confronting the global political economic systems that produce it. So that's why I'm here to place Boko Haram in the same analytical plane, to challenge the racialized boundaries of our conceptual categories, and to ask what it means to take global South reactionary movements as serious political subjects in a global conversation about ecological crisis. So who even is Boko Haram? Boko Haram originated in northeastern Nigeria in the early 2000s under the leadership of a Salafi preacher, Muhammad Yusuf. Its name is commonly translated as Western education is forbidden. The group initially functioned as a revivalist movement embedded in the specific socioeconomic grievances of the Borno state, and members joined from communities who had been abandoned by the state amid deepening poverty, youth unemployment, and declining public services. After Yusuf's extrajudicial killing in 2009, the movement transformed into a violent anti-state insurgency under Abubakar Shekau, marked by kidnappings, mass killings, and territorial conquest. Shekau's death in 2021 triggered further fragmentations, while its rival faction, the Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, consolidated control over islands, wetlands, and borderlands. And today, Boko Haram comprises of a constellation of actors sustained by governance voids created through decades of retreat and environmental decline. So Boko Haram's contemporary formation has to be situated within the wider political ecology of the Lake Chad Basin. Unfortunately, over the last 60 years, the lake has shrunk by a whopping 90%. Fisheries have collapsed, agricultural yields have declined, and millions have been pushed into chronic livelihood insecurity. This environmental degradation intersects with decades of structural adjustment, state withdrawal, austerity, and militarization, and the result is mass disenfranchisement, scarcity, and a profound crisis of governance. Interestingly, though, none of this appears in Boko Haram's ideological messaging. So Boko Haram doesn't actually use the language of climate change. There's no doctrinal texts where drought is explained through greenhouse gas emissions. There's no recruitment video blaming desertification on global warming. And instead, environmental suffering is reframed as divine punishment, a result of the corruption of the Nigerian state, the impurity of Western influence in Nigeria, and spiritual disorder of modernity. Essentially, environmental collapse is turned into a civilizational crisis narrative. And this is where I think we get to see some parallels with far-right ecologies globally. Far-right actors in Europe and North America routinely deny, distort, or silence climate science, yet they weaponize social anxiety produced by climate disruptions. Drought, food insecurity, demographic pressures, and economic decline are narrated through cultural or civilizational registers rather than material or scientific ones. Boko Haram does much of the same, although rooted in Islamic revivalist vernacular rather than nationalist one. In both cases, the material conditions of climate stress are present, but they are culturally reinterpreted, ideologically redirected, or simply erased from the narrative. And that erasure itself is a powerful form of climate politics. So even without the language of climate change, Boko Haram actively shapes and is shaped by the ecological landscape around Lake Chad. So I want to give there's numerous examples of this, but because we're limited on time and space, I'm just going to offer three. So the first is control over pastoral corridors. So Fulhani and Kunari herders crossing territories in the Borno state and in northwestern Adamawa routinely pay passage fees to Boko Haram. Amnesty International, Nigerian military reports, and various international crisis groups have demonstrated this taxation regime. And pastoral routes shift due to drought and decreasing pasturelands, and Boko Haram positions itself as a regulator of mobility in these deteriorating ecosystems. Second is their control and taxation, as well as fisheries. In the Difa region and in the islands of Lake Chad, there are numerous cases where Boko Haram levies fishing taxes on local communities. Research by Peruz and Montclos, and it shows that in some cases, fishermen prefer dealing with Boko Haram because their levies are predictable compared to corrupt state officials. So, in a region where fisheries collapse is one of the clearest consequences of environmental change, this becomes a form of de facto environmental governance. Third, by burning farmland, destroying irrigation systems, and displacing pastoralists into fragile ecosystems, sometimes at whim, Boko Haram magnifies environmental collapse, conflict-induced displacement, increased pressures on wetlands, forests, and water sources. And again, this is environmental politics performed through violence. These practices demonstrate that Boko Haram is engaged in climate politics through material governance rather than discourse. They are an insurgency whose survival is interwoven with the ecological breakdown, even if they don't ever utter the word climate or climate change. So I want to now pivot towards questions of how far-right ecological discourses shape sustainability science itself and why the frameworks we use matter. So one of the most influential narratives in climate change studies is the idea of climate change as a threat multiplier. This notion that environmental stress exacerbates instability, conflict, and migration. And at first glance, this framework feels kind of intuitive. It acknowledges that climate impacts intersect with political economic fragility. But the threat multiplier discourse is actually not politically neutral, and it didn't emerge from sustainability scholars or from climate scientists. Actually, the first major articulation appears in the US Center for Naval Analyses Military Advisory Board report in 2007. In the National Security and Threat of Climate Change document, which was co-authored by retired generals and admirals. And the report explicitly frames climate change as a force that will intensify terrorism, state instability, and cross-border migration. So it's now become the template for US and NATO climate security doctrine. And because of these origins, the framework carries an unstated assumption that climate-affected populations, which are overwhelmingly in the global south, pose risks to the global north. And in this logic, drought produces insurgents, famine produces instability, and displacement produces border threats in Europe. And vulnerability becomes danger. So this is precisely where far-right ecological narratives in the global north find traction. The threat multiplier framework primes the political imagination to see climate change as future chaos, and also invasion and even demographic pressure. And it reframes communities who are experiencing cultural violence as potential security problems. By depicting instability as inherent to the global south, in doing so, it reproduces racial hierarchies that far-right movements then mobilize. Especially we see this in US and European border securitization. Scholars like Mark Duffield and Betsy Hartman show how this framing is already shaping policy. Climate-induced migration is increasingly treated as a security threat, contributing to EU border fortification, to the expansion of Frontex, to the categorization of African migrants as climate security risks. In other words, climate research becomes entangled, sometimes unintentionally, with militarized and exclusionary agendas. So for the sustainability science community, this creates a huge challenge because research is entangled in security agendas. And as climate science becomes vulnerable to far-right accusations of conspiracy or globalist overreach, we have to be really careful about the frameworks and discursive analyses that we're putting forward. And this is where the Capitalocene framework, I think, becomes indispensable. The threat multiplier narrative reflects governing rationality of the Capitalocene itself, essentially a world order structured by centuries of extractive capitalism, racialized security, and imperial notions of disorder. And it treats climate breakdown as a security problem. And in this logic, militarizing borders is easier than reducing emissions, countering terrorism is easier than regulating oil companies, and pathologizing insurgency is easier than confronting the histories of extraction and neglect that make insurgency possible in the first place. Adopting this framework allows us to move past racist epistemologies and towards analytically nuanced perspectives that understand Boko Haram as a political formation shaped by the same forces that animate far-right ecologisms elsewhere. The collapse of social provision, for example, the erosion of state capacity, ecological devastation produced by fossil capital, and the search for purity, order, and identity in a world marked by perceived abandonment. So then, if we want to take climate sustainability science seriously, we have to reject these security frameworks that criminalize the global south while shielding the structures of capital accumulation that produce the crisis in the first place. Far-right movements and insurgent movements like Boko Haram are parallel products of the Capitalocene. So confronting ecological breakdown requires naming the political economic systems that underpin them both and uniting them in a single analytical frame rather than viewing them as two distinct phenomenon. This also means speaking directly when research is being misused to militarize borders or justify anti-immigrant policy throughout Europe or North America. And this is where my Boko Haram case study returns to the discussion. A narrow threat multiplier reading would suggest almost a linear causal chain where drought and the desiccation of Lake Chad has produced insurgency. But a historical materialist approach instead shows how climate change is filtered through colonial extraction, agrarian decline, neoliberal restructuring, and the long retreat of the Nigerian state. And these forces transform regional class structure and generate governance vacuums in which alternative authorities emerge. So Boko Haram's emergence within these fractures reflects the wider crisis of social reproduction that climate intensifies. I think I went a little bit over, so I will stop here. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Nerd. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. I think we have, I don't know, we can probably get right into the discussion part, and maybe you can ask a clarifying question, and we can link that with the broader, more substantial discussion questions. So now, as I mentioned in the introduction, this second part will be facilitated by Noémie Ganda. Noémie, I will leave the floor to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, Balsha, and Shinur for these amazing talks that really help us, I think, to make sense of the complexities, the ambiguities, the contradictions, and even the epistemic silences of when we engage with far-right movements and ideas in relation to the environment, and in particular climate change. So that was really enlightening for me, and I'm sure for most of the audience. And this is really important for us. It's really important for us, I think, to understand these complexities, as Balsha and Bernard mentioned, because, well, first, the times of outright climate denialism is kind of over. That's what I understood. It's, you know, it's a type of climate obstruction now that we're talking about. And also because, as Shinor, you highlighted, we need to trouble our views of what is the far right or what are far right projects, even what are far right projects, even if they are not related to nation states, for example, as in the case of Boko Haram. So as a kind of takeaway to start our discussion, what I hear from our speakers is that we need to see the reactionary movements, ideas, ideologies as a spectrum. And please, I ask the speakers to contradict me if they do not agree. So beyond these conventional understandings of the left and the right, global south, global north, beyond conventional understandings of what are political actors, and beyond Western capitalist views of democracy. And this is so important if we want to contribute to envisioning counter movements, counter ideas, new imaginaries of democracy, and how, you know, in new visions of democracy, we will live together. We will live life together in common with nature and the others. And how we are going to do sustainability science in our times of Trump, Milei, Orban, and Boko Haram, and unfortunately many more. So to start the discussion, I just wanted to ask you to give us a little hope and how we can unite our efforts as researchers, teachers, practitioners, citizens, parents, children to counter these narratives, or at least how we can unite our efforts to raise attention to them. And then we can also open the floor for questions from the audience. And I will be also looking for people who raise hands and or write in the chat.
If it's okay, I'll just say a few words on that. Thank you so much. That's a fantastic question. And thank you for moderating. In terms of hope, I think it really does. Hope is important and necessary. And I think a lot of that rests on our ability to be reflexive as scholars, to ask questions, to continuously, check the framings that we're using, the words, the terminology, and to not shy away from naming things as they are. I think we see that most clearly right now with the genocide unfolding in Palestine, where climate scientists who've dedicated their life to the study of creating addressing the climate crisis, refuse to speak about the ways in which the genocide is also an ecocide. So I think hope rests on our agency and our ability to name the structures, the issues, the problems as they are, and to practice reflexity, and to constantly be sure that we're mindful of underlying racial, class-based biases that might filter through the frameworks that we're using. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Did Balsha or Bernard, did you want to add something to what gives you hope?
Yes, I actually wanted to add something to what Shinar was saying, because this would have been my intervention. Obviously, reflection is something that is much needed, I think, when devising solutions, especially counter strategies. Counter to what? What exactly is it that we're countering? But there's this tension that Shinor mentioned, and I totally am on board with it, but at the same time, not sure how it can be resolved, because on the one hand, we need to slow down, I think, much as we are all apart, like the climate crisis is accelerating, the harmful effects are accelerating, becoming ever more visible, multiplying at scale, etc. But there has to be a need to kind of reflect on the types of slogans, messages, strategies that we are developing. So there's this happening on the one hand, like kind of being careful, making sure not to amplify exclusion through some of our messages that are quite commonly used also by environmentalists. But then at the same time, calling things as they are requires time and reflection to be very, to be sure that the things that the labels that you're using are actually accurate and that are helpful as well. And I'm not sure really how to resolve this. It's obviously, specific to the context, depending on the circumstances that you're trying to work in. But I think this is something to be carefully addressed, because my ongoing work, which is not necessarily related to the far right, as Noemi knows, is exactly looking into how these far right ecologist messages, if you can think of this far right ecologism as a set of messages, set of ideas about the world, how they permeate into the mainstream, how they become picked up by environmental activists. And what I realized in my experience so far is working now with environmental activists, which is a welcome change as compared to working with the far right, which I used to do before, is that you realize that if you want to slow things down, you really end up slowing everything down in the sense which maybe, the social change that is very much needed. So finding that right balance between having enough reflection on the messages that we all have to create, that we have to kind of, think of in a creative manner, and making sure that this doesn't do a disservice to the cause, is a very delicate thread to be woven. So yeah, not a whole lot of suggestions here, but really something just to an added piece of reflection.
I'm not that much into the business of optimism and hope these days, so I've already said something earlier. That's why I will not say anything more here. Just maybe emphasizing or stressing again that I think Balcha pointed to these complexities of the two quote unquote extremes. I don't really like that image, but I think that's actually a very good suggestion.
Fair enough. Thank you. Would you like maybe Bernard comment on the question, or give an answer to the question about what about the psychological so-called soft denial of the climate and ecological crisis that we had earlier in the chat, also referred to as disavowal?
Yeah. Thanks for that. I saw that one. So if we want to think conceptually about this, then it would probably fall within some type of secondary obstruction, in the sense that it is, a claim, a story, an argument, which doesn't necessarily deny the science, but obviously, it doesn't lead to any action. It might actually be strategically employed to prevent action. It might also, again, talking about this conceptually, it might also overlap with tertiary obstruction. And in the book by Ekberg, Climate Obstruction, there is, I think it's the 5th chapter, which is taking a psychological perspective, a social psychological perspective on the issue. So that 5th and final main chapter before the conclusion might be really interesting in this context. So what I'm saying is I don't see any kind of problem integrating that aspect into the framework. I'm sure we have all quote unquote seen it.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to add, if I may, I haven't addressed the spectrum issue, and obviously most of the in our research so far, we of course we investigate the categories that are already out there, but we also suggest that yes, they are quite pliant, they're quite flexible, and yes, they do form part of the spectrum. And with the right, it is no different. There is a substantive difference in how a neo-Nazi thinks about environmental protection. Again, I'm being here very generalizing. A neo-Nazi and radical right or conservative right politician. But at the same time, there are some very broad very general, but still shared traits, shared elements that we need to think about. So I would always say, yes, we should think about these processes as like kind of in these positions as a part of a spectrum, absolutely. But at the same time, we need to be aware that the categories are still important and they still help. Like we should call things as they are. Again, going back to that, and I think that just wanted to briefly mention this soft denial. Obviously, the yes but that I was talking about is, I think, a part of this soft denial, and it really makes me wonder because I've been doing a lot of research on the overlaps. Okay, so what happens, if we compare the far right to something else, be it the radical left, be it the mainstream right, be it the environmental activists, to what extent we are actually able to parse out the differences. If somebody was to remove the context, if we didn't know anything about these groups and organizations. So I think that this soft denial is basically the name of the game nowadays, and it has always been. Because we still, I think, by and large, when I say, as a society, our politicians, our governments, our regimes are still living in an era of this soft denial where we are kind of, similar to what children do, like kind of close our eyes and hope that the problem will somehow go away. It will definitely not. And I think that, yes, conceptually speaking, this soft denial, secondary obstruction, yes, but is goes well beyond the far right. So this is just something to definitely keep in mind as we are discussing the climate politics in general.
Thanks, Balsha. In the audience, you're welcome to also pose your question and not just write in the chat. So we had, I think, two questions that maybe Shenor could start answering. The first one was more maybe a clarification question: who's financing Boko Haram? And the second one about the critique of the single analytical framing, and if you might expand on the alternative, more nuanced perspectives vis-a-vis historical materialism. And again, the audience is welcome to ask their question and explain also beyond writing in the chat if you want.
Sorry, my cat is just right behind my laptop in case you hear her meowing. Yeah, thank you for those great questions. In terms of financing Boko Haram, thus far, research has not been able to confirm if they have been receiving funding from international organizations or states. So that part of the puzzle remains unclear. But what we do know with clarity, documented evidence, is that they're able to sustain their operations through the regulation of people and land and livestock in the Lake Chad region, specifically through mechanisms like taxation and extortion, racketeering, etc. Yeah, as of right now, it's a bit of a gray area that research is still being conducted on, but their internal operations are clearly recorded as being the largest portion that we know of their revenue, state revenue, if you could call them an alternative state. And in terms of the second question regarding the historical materialist perspective, yeah, thanks for asking that. The historical materialist perspective, or the framework that I refer to, was this world systems approach developed predominantly by Jason Moore and Andreas Malm, that locates the climate crisis and challenges the Anthropocene framing, which is the idea that climate change is a consequence of human action. It critiques that perspective, and instead, rather than blaming in general, abstract, universal humanity, locates the climate crisis squarely within capitalist production and social relations. And so when we think about using the Capitalocene framework to analyze movements like Boko Haram, that would entail looking at a kind of assemblage of different social factors and how they interact with each other, rather than the threat multiplier perspective that in many studies offers a more like a causal chain of conflict exists, climate happens, conflict gets worse, or low-level conflict exists, some climate catastrophe happens, and then conflict turns into full-blown insurgency or whatever. And so these single method perspectives frame this like straight line between conflict and climate in ways that aren't reflective of the reality on ground. So the historical materialist perspective allows us to bring into focus wider structures of violence like imperialism, ecological, historical ecological degradation, uneven capitalist development, all within a single framework to analyze how these shifting structures and processes and movements lead to the emergence or non-emergence of specific phenomenon in a given territory. So I hope that makes sense. I am in the process of publishing more on this. I have a paper coming out soon in critical terrorism studies called Colonial Epistemology and the Threat Multiplier Perspective. So I will be expanding on this framework a bit more. So it's great to get the chance to present it here and get everyone's feedback. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shinur. Super interesting. Maybe David, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's a bit of an expanding question on that. Thank you, Shinur, for your fantastic presentation and answer as much as time allows. But it was a very thought-provoking presentation. I was thinking about, some scholars say or would argue that liberalism is always the precondition to fascism. You cannot have the evolution of fascism without liberalism as a base. And the label of terrorism is proof of that, right? We see liberal states, label leftist groups as terrorists as much as right-wing groups in a sort of weird balancing act to try and establish, consolidate state power. And so I'm wondering, in the case of Nigeria, what is the relationship of the state to Boko Haram? Like we see examples like Brazil and Mexico, where the state is at once the big financier of the drug trade that profits from it, while at the same time clamping down through police violence to create a sense of social order. And so what is the relationship of the state to Boko Haram? And also, is there like a contestation by leftist groups? If Boko Haram is a reactionary right-wing extremist group in the vacuum of extractive liberalism, right? Because of the oil trade. Is this in the presence of a vacuum of leftist movements that have taken foothold, or is there a contestation? What is the relationship to the state? So what's the constellation of actors, I guess I'm wondering, between these? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's such an interesting and important question. And actually, I had wanted to touch on it in my presentation, but I didn't get the chance to. But the Nigerian state's relationship to Boko Haram is a really interesting one because, on the one hand, Boko Haram and its existence is actually quite valuable to the Nigerian state because its mere existence enables Nigeria to receive millions upon millions of dollars in security aid from the United States through the imperialistic AFRICOM organization. Just recently, I presented on this as well, on the history of AFRICOM, and noted that I think it was something along the lines of between 2019 and 2022, Nigeria received $650 million for the purposes of fighting Boko Haram. And actually, not to self-promote, but this is my third chapter that's coming out, is going to be on this relationship between AFRICOM and the militarization of Nigeria, and how they receive this massive amounts of not just security aid, but also a transfer of weapons and technology, and also training of its police and military forces. How they receive that through the justification of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism measures, but how that actually is then redirected to strengthen the security apparatus in Nigeria and then used for the protection of fracking infrastructure in southern Nigeria and the Niger Delta. So the relationship of Boko Haram and the Nigerian state is somewhat of a kind of turn a blind eye. The state already doesn't have, administrative reach in those areas, and the total elimination of Boko Haram would cut off this aid that's absolutely instrumental to the protection of this oil infrastructure in the southern regions. And of course, the oil infrastructure is also supported by the expansive oil corporations that have their companies there. For example, Shell often partners with the Nigerian state as well to engage or bring in private contractors to protect their infrastructure, but it's nothing that compares to or could come close to the security aid and funding that they get from the United States and through the AFRICOM organizations. So yeah, I could go on there. It's a multifaceted kind of response, I think, but I'll just stop here and limit it to that and say, unfortunately, there does seem to be a bit of a vacuum in which no leftist organization has really been able to pose any kind of real challenge to Boko Haram or to the state, unfortunately. So yeah, I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinur. I think we have a question in the chat, and that would be more directed to maybe Bernard and Balsha. So thinking beyond messaging and discourse, even if far-right climate acceptance seems to be stalling, far-right presence in national parliaments and the European Parliament is increasing, which means that these parties have an increasingly prominent say in shaping actual policy outcomes. So here comes the question: do you see these discourses materializing in actual climate environmental policies, or do these parties continue to hamper the implementation of such policies? I don't know which of you, maybe Bernard or...
I can give it a go, and then Balsha continues, and I hope he's not going to contradict. Yeah, I mean, there is some research which is a little bit older, which made the argument that actually at least in Europe, with a multi-party system, the inclusion of these parties didn't have a huge effect because there is this very specific party system, at least on the continent. And because obstructionist positions not necessarily kind of are the very first thing these parties want to implement. But obviously, as time has moved on and as these parties have often become more influential, stronger, as Peter points out, I think we do see, on the one hand, these more direct effects. And I mean, obviously in the US, which is a different context, this is most clearly visible. But what I would stress is not so much the direct effects, the direct materialization, but maybe more the indirect ones, because the strengthening of these parties implies is that the landscape, the options in the political field are changing, i.e., the options for those actors who maybe were never particularly keen on these policies. And that, of course, concerns primarily center-right forces, but I don't necessarily want to give excuses to center-left forces either. But we have seen this, for example, yesterday in the European Parliament, with there now being the option, and that option has materialized, to cut green rules, and the center right, with support of the far right, kind of got this through. A classic case is also in Germany, the heating law, and the entire public debate around this change to how heating should evolve in Germany, where the AfD is not in the government, but was a key part in influencing the public debate. And it looks like that now this law is going to be watered down by a subsequent coalition. So we don't know what happens in an alternative universe, but might well be that this development would not have taken place if there wouldn't have been this strong far right actor to push something and to change the configuration of the political field. Thank you.
Thank you. Basha, did you want to
Yeah.
contradict Bernard?
No. Not much that I would add. This is, I think, I mean, totally agree with what Bernhard said, and it's very evident in not just European politics, but also worldwide. Like whenever you have a strong far right actor for far right party, even if it is, even if there's a cordon sanitaire around it or whatever, it's very clear that they are influencing the debate. And this is what the mainstreaming of the far right is about. It's not necessarily about the electoral successes. It's not necessarily about far right entering governments. It is about influencing the norm, influencing permissibility, what is considered as okay in a society, but also influencing policies in that way. So it makes me wonder. It's not that it makes me wonder, it's really already becoming quite visible. The effect of these processes that you outlined, Peter, on radical environmentalism and such. Because I already see this was especially after the pandemic and especially after the with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, that the green idea is, I mean, green idea, and I'm not just talking about green parties generally, but about like ecologism as an ideology, it is running out of steam. It is having difficulties to kind of offer something that resonates with the needs, the way they are framed, of the electorate, of the voters, of people, if you please. So makes me wonder, what this far right presence, if it is this increased far right presence, if it is going to affect the policy. I don't think that the policy is necessarily going to be anti-environmentalist, because we've seen, and I've been pretty much presenting. I mean, this is one of the main takeaways of my presentation, that yes, the far right can develop environmental policies as such. It's just that they're not going to be uh, focused as much on justice. They're not going to be focused on radical solutions that are pretty much necessary to address the climate crisis. And as a consequence of that, we are likely to see more of the status quo, or even worse, backsliding in terms of especially human rights, etc., under the name of the energy transition, the green transition, blah blah. And this is exactly why I use the Balkans example to show how these processes are being used by the right, but also by the far right to kind of, on the one hand, make themselves look environmentalist, green, whatever, but on the other hand, also have a really harmful effect on the society as such.
Makes sense. Thank you for that response. We have still a few minutes, maybe 9-10 minutes for questions and comments. So if there's anybody in the audience who would like to add or ask a question. Otherwise, I have a question. Bernard, I was really triggered by, you just mentioned India, that, maybe it would, I don't remember what to say, that it would add another layer of complexity to the argument. So is this related also to what Shenor mentioned about the fact that we need to think about the far right and far right ideas beyond the global south, global north binary, or did you mean something else?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, definitely it relates. I would say it relates in the sense that we cannot simply assume that what we produce in the global north or global north knowledge is, and concepts and so on and so forth, are simply to be universalized. So that's in line with what we have heard. But I think what I meant when I spoke or referred to India was even more kind of explicitly or directly connected. That is thinking about the Modi government there, which is a far right political force, quote unquote, proper. So there's no need to. It is a force which is not just exclusionary, authoritarian, but that exclusion is clearly built around an ethno-nationalist idea, and so on and so forth. So we have an actor there which is clearly relevant to our discussion, and that's the complexity. It is an actor which does not, as by the way, other similar actors in the global south, doesn't necessarily deny climate change or obstruct it in the sense we know from the likes of Trump or this or that European politician, but where we have, for example, quite a lot of investment in renewables. And that's where this example would connect to what Balja has just said. It is a quote unquote an environmentalist politics, which is heavily invested in exclusionary practices through, for example, the way but through the way these policies are implemented, these renewable energy policies are implemented, and what they try to achieve, how they are justified, how they are interwoven with Hindutva ideas, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of what I wanted to point out.
Thank you. Thank you. That makes sense. Anybody else who has questions, comments? Yes.
If not, I did have a question. I was wondering, how do these far-right narratives and discourse change when it comes to the national versus international climate action? Did you find that they are more against multilateral environmental processes, or is the opposition mostly local? Maybe to Balsa or yeah, whoever wants to reply.
There's some recent research, I believe, and I was even invited to review a paper that is actually dealing with this topic, and I haven't read it, so I cannot offer a very detailed response. But from what I could see, looking at the cases that I was looking at, so Hungary, Poland, you could say also Czechia, but Hungary and Poland were interesting because of the far right in power, being in power. Poland not any longer, but it used to be. I would say that yes, there is obviously generally speaking a negative effect. So obviously the far right in power does more harm than good. But with Orban was like, for instance, taking a lot of pride in being like kind of international climate champion, kind of being very proud, again, publicly speaking, for the purpose of the political communication of the efforts Hungary has made in climate mitigation strategies on the international level. And I think that that is quite interesting and quite telling. In the case of Hungary, the way I would justify this is it didn't cost Hungary much to do that. And I think that's the case with a number of Eastern European countries, actually, because they're quite aware that whatever they do is not going to make that big of a difference, and it doesn't take a lot of effort on their end to be progressive from the perspective of international climate policy making. But at the same time, it is like I don't know. It is an emblem or whatever, a permit for them to say, oh, look, we are environmentalists and we can do whatever we want in domestic politics, which is usually not environmental in any way. So again, a very simplified and superficial take from me here, but I think it is this is the general storyline that I get from the Eastern European cases. But again, more research is needed, and I think will be published in the years to come on this, like in a more systematic way.
Thank you for this response. Any maybe last question or next to last? or comment by one of our speakers? That's something that you would like to share? Like personally, I think this is like this discussion really shows how important it is for us interested in sustainable environmental issues, climate change issues, to engage with the rise of, we call it far right, but we can call it reactionary movements, but and also how important it is to question our ways of engaging with it. This is an urgent task also given the conjuncture, but also task that we have to take seriously and not just rush into. And as Shiner also highlighted, think about our, our colonial ways of sometimes doing research, even on the far right on these questions. So I hope, like as a facilitator here, I hope that this is, not the end, that this is just the beginning for more fruitful conversations and for, for hopeful practices and thinking together about how we can imagine and work together towards more democracy and sustainability. And I give back the floor to Viola, who has some last announcements to make.
Well, yes, thank you, Noemi, and thank you to everyone who contributed to this lively and insightful discussion. And of course, a special thanks to our speakers, Shneur, Balsa, and Bernard for sharing their presentations and their time with us on a Friday afternoon. And also, of course, thank you to Noemi for facilitating this important discussion. So if you've enjoyed the topic of the discussions and would like to go further, we have prepared a reading list for you to explore the topic of far-right ecologies and their complexities further. We will share it now in the chat, but since few people have left, we will send it by email after the forum as well. There is going to be another forum always as part of the Pathways Deep Dive project that I've mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. You can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn to not miss the updates. And of course, we'd love to see you there. So lastly, if you'd like to watch the recording of this webinar or those of our previous webinars or future ones, they're all available on our YouTube channel. And so please don't hesitate to share them with colleagues who might be interested in learning more. And so, yeah, thank you again to our speakers for these great presentations and to Noemi for facilitating. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Have a nice weekend.